My research started actually when just after the Academies Act 2011, where I was responsible for the conversion of the school I worked in into an academy. So that led to my sort of research in governance, and I'd supported governors over a 20-year period as senior leadership in senior leadership teams. So my area is post-new governance towards development empowered governance frameworks in the school. I won't spend too much time on the abstract, but as it's been shared, but the presentation really provides a counter narrative to the policy of academisation, principally from 2010, but actually earlier than that, from 2003 in New Labour and the introduction of the city academies. And I hope to illustrate how the idea and ideology of new public management and the policy of academisation has actually just enabled a top-down governance framework to emerge. Um, uh, I discuss the democratic deficit and highlight various governance failures. Um, uh, with new public management and new governance, the terms that we know, but I developed this idea that we need to go beyond new governance and go back to more of a stakeholder democratic models. So we termed it post-new governance, and I argue that alternative democratic innovations are required to restore the power base within academized systems. And I discussed the networks around a school, and call them micro-governance networks, and the notion that we need to move to more bottom-up uh, forms of governance. So I'd start just briefly with new public management. That might be a subject that's really well known to people, but many in education don't really understand the background to new public management. Clearly, they experience it every day in schools. But okay, so from 1979, the introduction, Thatcher government, introduction of the minimalist state, it extended regulation, audit, and evaluation, and it reformed public sector. It privatized the state, many areas of the state. Um, Cable and wireless, British Gas, that sort of thing, airways. And significant issues arise from the introduction of new public management. In fact, new public management led to the creation of standards, arguably standards to measure performance, and emphasis on results, and we know about that in schools, rather than procedures, results rather than procedures, the use of contracts, franchise agreements, and the promotion of competition. So new public management strategies raise concerns over issues of governance in the public sector, and you could argue that the market has taken over our schools. This slide is representing the state of education and the transition from government to governance. Prior to new public management, the government was the funder and deliverer, delivered public services, local government. The notion of government to governance is the idea that organizations become autonomous, like academies, and therefore governance becomes important and accountability. So we often discuss the ideas of autonomy and accountability. I actually worked in a school in 1988 and soon after that, when the Education Reform Act was introduced, and people thought that the notion of grant maintained status would create a massive market, but I don't think it did then. But what I've done is highlight a number of significant acts that shifted education from the state to autonomous bodies, independent bodies, and then therefore the shift from government to governance. Governance became very important. Um, The Academies Act, of course, that many of us have worked through, creation of autonomous privatised edgy businesses within a quasi market. Say it's a quasi market because it's actually not really a market. There's an illusion of a market. And educational governance is argued to be in crisis because of new governance, because there is very definitely a democratic deficit with the old local authority schools, for instance. You had elected representatives, large governing bodies, and stakeholder engagement. And I'll show through examples that very often, all too often, that's no longer the case. I'll give some examples of crises of government. A recent one, if anyone, and it'd be useful to come back to this in discussion. This isn't in school so much, it's in FE. But I don't know if people have picked up, but Western College um, uh, went into effectively special measures, serious governance failures. The FE commissioner was arguing 2.5 million in hidden payments to the principal, Sir Paul Phillips, just prior to retirement. I mean, that's astonishing that a governing board could allow that to happen. There was a presidential paid role post-retirement for Sir Paul. And Phillips's son was chief financial officer, then made chief operating officer. So he signed off, of course, these payments, except arguably there was some payments he didn't sign off. But interestingly, Ofsted suggested it was an outstanding institution. And I find in my research that very often where there's significant governance flaws and issues, Ofsted really don't pick this up under their governance and leadership dimension. So significant governance failure there. So what I do, I'm going to go through a number of governance failures and relate it to democratic deficit. And then I'm going to propose just for discussion some more bottom-up, more democratic innovations for governance. An example of top-down governance and that illustrates a democratic deficit was the Academy's Enterprise Trust. And I've written a number of papers and presented on this. And I'm going to use it as an example. Of course, this academic year, the Academy's Enterprise Trust did rebrand, and they're now called Lift Schools. Um, uh, the trust is one of the largest multi-academy trusts in the country. It was the largest at one point, 57 schools and around about 250 million budget. And it exhibits a classical hierarchical structure that excludes stakeholder voice. So if we were to look at the framework, you'll see there's a board of trustees, and I will come to the current shape, governance architectural shape that's been rolled out this year. But what we have above, actually, this diagram was taken broadly from there, with a few changes, broadly from the website. But above the trustees in a multi-academy trust, you have members. And the members here within Academy's Enterprise Trust, and I believe it's the same now, but the detail isn't on their website, is only three people. Now, these three members are responsible for appointing the trustees, and also the contract, the funding agreement with the government is with those three people. The trustees is a very small group of highly respected professional people in the sector. Um, and we can see here that incredibly hierarchical. The local governing body is right down here, as you can see towards the bottom. I think you can see my cursor moving. And then there's a parent and community advisory board. Well, I'm just going to go through the local governing board, which obviously now is acknowledged not to have any real power because that is invested in the trustees. But I'll just show you the composition of these boards. So at the local level, we had the governing body, and I'd argue that it's constituted in such a way as to inhibit meaningful stakeholder engagement. So David Carter, who was the schools commissioner, advises you can't have credible vision that talks about supporting and developing school communities if you do not give them a voice. Well, David Carter was vice chair of AAT, and actually, I discovered only recently, did write the foreword to the DFE's governance handbook. But we'll just look at the level of voice that they have because they're not involved in the members and they're not involved in the trustees. They're technically involved in the local governing board. But this is the local governing board as of last year for the local school in my area, which is Teesside. So you can see the governing board is made up of a chair of an AET Academy, regional director, the principal of the primary academy, a vice principal, and some of these are out of area, the say 60, 70 miles away in Hull, school support services AET, and clerk to governors AET. So the governing board are governing themselves arguably. There's no external accountability. You've got one member, sorry, two members that are on the board. But in fact, um, it looked to me as if only one member did actually attend this board, and you can't get hold of within the AET any minutes of meetings. It asks you to write in for those, but I did write in, I didn't get a response. So you can see there's clearly, arguably, I would suggest, little or no external accountability within the Academy's Enterprise Trust. Now, what we have here is the Lift Schools, which is AAT rebranded. The members who are responsible for appointing the trustees are omitted from the website. I can't find them. I suspect there's a previous AET members. Interestingly, looking through their website, David Carter still chairs the education committee, but is not a trustee. And what I found is many of the individuals involved know each other professionally and involved in lots of committees together. For instance, the Education Endowment Foundation, one of the members is on the board there, and Professor Becky Francis actually was an advisor with AET. Lift schools are suggesting academy councils play a critical role in terms of providing an external voice. And I've just about finished with the examples here, and then I'll come on to structures that are really quite different to this, radically different. So I won't go through all of the detail on the current Lift schools, not academies, Academy Council. But it's interesting to know that an Academy Council, bearing in mind they don't have local governing bodies any longer, the Academy Council will be quorate if the chair member, which is a member of the organisation, the principal, and at least one member of the council is present. So the correlative one, I mean, that's in all my years supporting Covenants, which is about 20 years or more. We never had that in our constitution. It was always a lot more than that for external involvement. So I just highlight some of the compelling evidence that is around that advises that there's meaningless community-based governance arrangements and it needs to change. For instance, the House of Commons Committee for Public Accounts cited the National Education Union, saying there's a deficit of accountability in the academised system. House of Commons, the Education Select Committee, are advising there's too much emphasis on upward accountability, not enough local engagement. Again, here, as you can see, yet more evidence, and there's an abundance of evidence. I just pulled out a few examples here. I think I've got 15 minutes left, so what I shall do now is to look at post-new governance, because the governance that I've just highlighted, and of course the Academy's Enterprise Trust and Lift Schools, are sector-leading organisations. And if we have this form of democratic deficit, this form of exclusion of stakeholders, we know it exists pretty much throughout the sector. So moving on to post-new governance, this arguably enables new structures to emerge. I've brought in some citations here: Skelter and Toffling, observation that performance of multi-layered entangled governance, and that's like the AAT system, is hampered by a persistent lack of democratic legitimacy. So let's move on from that. This slide illustrates a governing body, and I did some research on cooperatives. I was very interested in cooperatives, and in fact, I was involved in some of the very early cooperatives with the Cooperative College and the then CEO Mervyn Wilson, in developing structures that the DFE would approve, governance structures that they would approve. And what we had here, and then I've developed it myself, not that the DFE would allow it, but it's useful for conversation. So what we've got here is a school whereby we've got members of various membership groups. So we've got parents and carers, constituencies, they're called constituencies within the cooperative college, but they're just members groups. A staff constituency, learners, community, and alumni. Now, some of these schools, their membership groups, have a couple of thousand members as they're sort of signed up. There's then within certain case studies that I've been involved with, from these 2,000 members, they are formally elected to a forum, which is a bit like the Members Association in Cambridgeshire. And in my biography, you'll see that I've worked in community schools in Cambridgeshire and in Bington Village College, which is arguably a leading community education establishment going back from the 1939 and Henry Morris. So you've got membership groups that are very similar to the village colleges and the very powerful voices from the community, community voice. So here we've got membership groups elected to a forum. The forum is around about 40 strong. And then from the forum, their input on the governing board. The governing board elects parent governors, and there can be around about 20 on the governing board. And effectively, it's a huge amount of governance capital. If we look at the trustees in some of the leading academy trusts, I would argue that there's very little governance capital. Very experienced professional people, but there's only around 3 or 7 or very, very low numbers. And what we find is they're on multiple boards. And I would argue don't have time. There's a lack of capacity and capital. Here, it's really very strong. Interestingly, the trustees, when some of the cooperative academies formed, the trustees became members. So the members were effectively bottom-up elected people and all local. And I call this, this slide, we made the road by walking because we discussed the journey of engagement, and it reminded me of a book that I dipped into years ago on Paulo Freire, a discussion, and it was entitled "We Make the Road by Walking," and I think we make the democratic road by just engagement and by doing, and I think that's really important. The next slide then. I mean, this is an inverted system. If we look at the Academy's Enterprise Trust, this is governance flipped in relation to the AET structure. And actually, I'm picking on AET. It's most academy structures. And I know many people that have joined tonight's discussion will be teachers in academies, as I worked in academies, and I'll actually be involved in academy boards. It doesn't mean to say that we necessarily like it, or we don't acknowledge there are better ways of governing. So here we have a democratic innovation. The next one takes this a step further. This wouldn't be passed by the DFE at the moment, but I suspect it could be worked on and sent in as a model, because what this does is flip the governance. It's entirely bottom up. So you've got the local membership groups, a bit like the Members Association and the cooperative one that I've showed. So all those bodies, the parents, the students, alumni, teachers, a very strong membership within in that body. Now, there's no reason that the funding agreement with trust, that's the funding agreement with the Academy Trust is from the government, funds the entire trust. And as we said, with the AET, it's around about 250 million. And the agreement is, as I mentioned, with three people. Here, we could have the local membership groups, and then I've put them back at the top here, because they then would elect, as they did in the cooperative structure, a forum or a members association. It's an elected body. Now, it's an elected body of 40 people. Why can't they hold the funding agreement? So it's a community-based funding agreement with the Department for Education. So then we've got members who then appoint the Board of Trustees and hold the Board of Trustees account. So rather than three holding, say, 10 people to account, what we've got here is a members body, a very strong stakeholder-driven group of people that would then appoint a Board of Trustees that can be drawn from above and appointed externally, and they've got their delegated powers. At a more local level, so this could happen across a trust, but at a more local level, we know the governing bodies can't exist any longer. They've got no, the consultative bodies effectively, because they haven't got any formal powers. So you could still have some sort of local school consultative board and the members within that body. So it is a flipped governance structure, entirely flipped. And if the Board of Trustees isn't performing, the members themselves, the stakeholder body, would be able to address the situation. Whereas we see in governance failures within the academies sector, it's very difficult to, I'll just admit someone, it's very difficult for the board, a very small board, to be able to have any external influence. So this is a democratic innovation, and what it does is flip the system and is as far removed from the current top-down models as I guess you can have. The next innovation, and this is the last one, and written about this with Nigel Gann, but other other people, notably Stephen Ball, presented a paper. I think it was called "The Tragedy of State Education," in which he mentioned local education boards. And the notion of this is like the third innovation. The notion is that you set up a local board for education. It would oversee the effectiveness of all statutory provision in that area. We say it would be based on current local authority, coterminous with local authority boundaries. It would be interesting in that it would cover early years to FE. It would include independent, any form of education in that area. It ensures public accountability. It would enable cooperation between providers. It would ensure fair admission arrangements. It would disseminate best practice. Replaces local authority involvement, and it also would replace there would be no need for, and arguably, I heard a lot of people, professionals in the sector, would argue about the need for the old regional directors or the DFE directors, formerly the regional schools commissioners and the head teacher advisory boards. There'd be no need for that. You would have a local body. It would have its membership. It would be elected membership from stakeholders and responsible directly to Parliament. It's a democratically accountable, and we would argue it's a robust structure. Those that have been discussing and working the shape of a local education board. Of course, we had local education boards. I think in the was it the 30s and 40s of some form. It provides an oversight and a standardization within the sector, and it would replace the piecemeal, fragmented, and ad hoc system that's evolved since 2010. And in concluding, having presented these democratic models that would go some way to addressing the democratic deficit. It's saying I'd say that the prevailing ideological discourse is academization. We know that. And drawing on Fielding and Moss, arguably a dictatorship of no alternative. Yet I'd argue that democratic alternatives exist and that there's compelling counter narratives to academized systems and structures. And we really need to explore and promote those. And flipped governance models that I've proposed are feasible and they're presented for analysis and critique within a developing narrative of democratic innovation and actually to sustain the concept of comprehensive community education. And I'll finish there. My references, I haven't listed them all, but basically, essentially all those references are in two of my papers.